On February 20th, over 40 American Fulbrighters from around Europe convened for the 2018 Fulbright Seminar on the European Union and NATO. Over the next 5 days, the group, which included 10 grantees based in Germany, would visit and get to know many of the most important institutions of European politics and transatlantic relations. The Fulbrighters met up in Brussels and then hopped on a bus headed for Luxembourg. After checking into their hotel, the group was treated to a walking tour of Luxembourg City.
There was not sort of Germany, so that Prussia and the French Empire under Napoleon III.
Later that evening, the Fulbrighters arrived at the American Embassy in Luxembourg for a round of briefings. First, a lecture from Dr. Jerome Sheridan, an EU expert and the director of American University's Brussels Center.
When we stopped at the Luxembourg Embassy, it was our first stop of the trip, and we heard from Jerry Sheridan, who is a professor and just absolutely electric speaker. He is also just so well versed on everything having to do with the EU, and wow, what a firecracker it was to start off our trip with a talk from Jerry.
Dr. Sheridan was followed by the embassy's public affairs officer, Dan Paterini. To wrap up the first day, the Fulbrighters were treated to a reception hosted by the embassy. Day 2 got off to a fast start as the group arrived at the European Court of Justice soon after 8 a.m. After clearing security, they observed a hearing for a case being considered by the court.
It was very interesting. So it actually was about fireworks and how the storage of fireworks and explosives work within the European context. So, you know, I could go into more of the case, but I think what's really interesting about it, more so than what actually happened, was this cooperation between member states and the actual European court itself. So you have a member state, Belgium in this case, that didn't really understand the full context of its law and needed clarification in order to carry out what the EU had instructed.
Many Fulbrighters were also impressed by the simultaneous translation of the proceedings into multiple languages.
That was very amazing to see as someone that's learning German right now, that people can be that good at translating and that fast.
After the hearing was over, the president of the court, Dr. Koen Lennarts, shared some insight on the institution he leads. And guess what? He's a former Fulbrighter himself. And so is General Court Judge Dr. Paul Nihul, who also addressed the group. Before departing, everyone enjoyed a delicious lunch provided by the court. Then it was off to the Bastogne War Museum, which commemorates World War II's famous Battle of the Bulge.
This museum was redone in 2014, and it's not that often you get the chance to see a very, very new museum that is really on the front end of what people are doing in representational work, especially in a war museum, right? So that aspect was really interesting to see what direction they chose to take it. Another aspect of the museum that I was really impressed by was the number of artifacts that they had into it. They'd obviously curated their collection really carefully, and their choice to use this method of following narratives of semi-fictionalized accounts of characters through a very short time period was really emotionally evocative, and I'm sure that it's very, very effective at getting visitors to connect with the story that they're hearing.
Next to the museum is the Martisson Memorial, which honors the sacrifices of American soldiers in the battle. After exploring the museum and the surrounding grounds, the Fulbrighters enjoyed a quick snack and then piled onto the bus. It was back to Brussels, where a surprise would be waiting.
The Fulbright Commission here in Belgium surprised us a couple nights ago with a waffle truck when we got back to the hotel. And so we had 30 minutes where all the Fulbrighters just descended on this waffle truck outside the hotel. And we could have all the waffles that we could get in that time frame. I had 3, and I'm just super thankful that the Fulbright Commission put that little surprise in our schedule, because that was wonderful.
On Thursday, the Fulbrighters were up and at 'em early again, this time to walk over to the European Commission. The Commission is responsible for the day-to-day business of the EU, as well as many other decisions and initiatives. The group heard from several speakers who gave insight on EU investment policy, opportunities for study funding in the EU, and trends shaping the EU's foreign policy.
It was good because they kind of explained the structuring of how funding works in the EU, and they explained about that money kind of flows from richer countries to poorer countries and how they go about distributing money for funding projects in the form of grants. And then it was also nice to hear a little bit about all the scholarship programs and how that fits into the grand scheme of the EU for kind of uniting Europe.
After lunch in the Commission's cafeteria, the group headed over to the U.S. mission to the European Union, located within walking distance from the Commission. There, the Fulbrighters were divided into small groups where grantees living in different European nations could compare their experiences. This was followed by a panel discussion entitled Academia Meets Policy, Making a Difference in the Real World. Several Fulbright professors shared some insight on public engagement from their careers. The evening concluded with a reception where Fulbrighters had the opportunity to chat with U.S. Foreign Service officers and other guests.
Our trip to the U.S. mission to the European Union was very interesting for all of us because I think this mission really represents a lot of what we're talking about in terms of developing or maintaining this transatlantic bond we have between the U.S. and Europe in general. And this was really evident during our time together with the two Foreign Service officers. It was a really wonderful experience to sit down with two people who work at the mission and talk in a very open way about some of the challenges we face in this very special relationship, and also what's so special about it and why it needs to continue.
On Friday morning, the Fulbrighters headed over to NATO headquarters, which is also located in Brussels. Cameras were not allowed inside the building, but the group heard from a variety of NATO personnel.
I was very new to the idea of NATO, and it turns out I'm not the only one. We heard from our first speaker that one of the biggest challenges that NATO faces is actually just name recognition and getting people to understand what NATO is and what it isn't. They did polls in something like 16 countries and found that, you know, in the single digits of people could actually describe what NATO is. So maybe I had a little bit more of a baseline than that, but yeah, that seems to be one of their big challenges, and I certainly came away learning a lot from it.
The group wrapped up its visit to NATO at lunch, where each table got to chat with a NATO employee or representative. They then headed over to the Royal Library of Belgium. There, the Fulbright Schumann researchers gave presentations about their projects. The Fulbright Schumann program funds graduate and postgraduate study, research, and lecture proposals in the field of U.S.-EU relations, EU policy, or EU institutions.
One of the Fulbright Schumann presentations that I was fascinated by was about language policy. And basically the scholar Greg was talking about how every city that he goes to, he's looking at signs, which is just not even something you really kind of think about. Like, you'll notice a sign, you might laugh if it's funny, but the way that he can articulate what it means and kind of the impact of how people choose to put signage in which languages and maybe the repercussions, the good things, the bad things, that was really fascinating.
That evening, the Fulbrighters enjoyed the last event of the conference, a goodbye dinner at a Brussels restaurant. The Germany-based Fulbrighters came away with a deeper appreciation and understanding of the institutions they visited, and were very thankful for the opportunity to attend the conference.
I think the conference did an excellent job of introducing me, someone who wasn't as familiar with European institutions, with the EU and with NATO, and with the role of U.S. representatives here to each of those bodies.
It's just great to see how these organizations work from the inside. It's a rare opportunity, and it just felt like, you know, like such an opportunity to actually be able to engage with them and for them to be so genuine and open with us.
This conference has been one of the highlights of my Fulbright experience so far.